Well, the government recently came out with its draft e-commerce policy, which seeks to give Indian online retailers a level playing field when they're pitted against the global big boys. This is also an attempt to try and in the government's assessment, prevent the bloodletting in the brick-and-mortar businesses. The draft policy, among others, recommends a sunset clause which defines the maximum duration for which e-tailers can engage in differential pricing strategies. This might make it difficult for big online retailers to shower deep discounts on customers for a prolonged period of time. That's not all. The draft policy further places curbs on related parties, recommends that bulk purchases of white goods, which could lead to price distortions in a marketplace, be prohibited. Further, no foreign-funded company be allowed to keep inventory. Will this India-first approach really create a level playing field for domestic players? According to a report by eMarketer, e-commerce sales will climb about 31% to $32.7 billion in 2018. That's not all. The e-commerce market in India is expected to grow to $200 billion by 2026. That's the kind of opportunity that we're talking about. To discuss the draft e-commerce policy and its implications for India, we're now joined by the former DIPP Secretary Ajay Dua, Amarjeet Singh, Partner Tax Regulatory and Internet Business at KPMG, and Abhiraj Behel, co-founder at Urban Clap. Gentlemen, appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV18. Mr. Dua, let me start by asking you, what is it in this draft e-commerce policy that is going to change the rules of the game, so to speak? Do we not currently have regulation in place that is enough to regulate this ecosystem?
Shireen, you're probably right that bits and pieces about what's in this draft policy have been stated by different wings of the government and at different points of time. This will probably, the attempt or the endeavor seems to be to put them down in one comprehensive policy at one place, even the existing rules and regulations be compiled and put out. But having said that, the question is, what the government seems to have defined the objective for it, which you very rightly called it as India First. That India First for the sake of, are we looking at it as the retailers or the producers or the larger universe of consumers? Does it take adequate, or is there adequate balance in this policy, the draft policy, for all three, particularly the Indian consumer?
You believe that the Indian consumer is actually going to be at the receiving end if these recommendations go through?
Looks like.
Okay.
There is a very high degree of possibility.
Okay, that this is actually going to be anti-consumer. But let me go across to Amarjeet. Amarjeet, just to take the point forward from what Mr. Dua was saying, if you take a look at what this draft e-commerce policy suggests, areas that are highlighted include regulation, funding, pricing, discounting, data storage, consumer grievance and protection. Now, under the press notes earlier issued by government, we have a lot of these regulations in place. You already have the Competition Commission of India that looks at anti-competitive practices. We're now talking about the need for a new regulator that will regulate only e-commerce. Is this a little over the top?
I think, Shin, you're absolutely right. Because I think what they are trying to do is trying to actually control a sector which is booming today, which is attracting foreign investment. And if you try to actually put a policy around a sector which is which is dependent upon innovation, dynamism, I think we are just trying to choke this entire sector by putting multiple regulation and actually creating a regulator around something which has so many verticals. There are so many different kind of entrepreneurs which have started e-commerce. Now the point is, again, there's a confusion between what are they trying to control. E-commerce as a term encompasses so many verticals, whether it is in relation to financial services, whether it is in relation to e-tailing, whether it is in relation to travel, etc. Getting a single policy around everything, I think, is going to create a problem. And in any case, I think we've got some robust press notes already, like press note 3 on its own talks about influencing price from a discount perspective. Press note 3 on its own talks about 25% limitation in terms of not one vendor can sell. Press note 3 covers so many aspects relating to e-tailing today. I think there's definitely an overreach of the legislature which we are seeing here, because today what they are saying, not only the platform can not only influence, but they are now trying to control the vendor, technically speaking. Now, how can you control a vendor whether he can give discounts or not? So I think somewhere you're absolutely right. We are just going too much into details, and this will actually create a problem for the sector's growth.
It will create a problem. This is a case of overreach. That is the view there of Amarjeet. But Abhiraj, as an entrepreneur, as somebody who runs Urban Clap, what do you make of the many changes that the government is talking about through its recommendations in this draft e-commerce policy? And as Amarjeet was pointing out, a lot of this in some form or fashion already exists as part of the regulatory architecture. How do you read this?
Well, I think in our case, I was part of the think tank which was advising the government on the national policy for e-commerce. I think the government is, honestly looking at it at three levels. The first is, how do you create a level playing field between global companies and Indian companies? How do you ensure that things like capital dumping, etc. don't happen?
What is an Indian company today, Abhiraj? What is an Indian company today? Most Indian companies, most Indian e-tailers are funded by the Japanese, are funded by the Chinese, are funded by the American. What is an Indian company today in a market where capital is global in nature?
Absolutely, I agree with you, and I think that's a question that needs to be discussed and debated. I'm just sort of narrating to you what is the view of the government as they are forming this policy without taking a judgment on it. So one of their views is that can Indian homegrown organizations, not taking into account a few big names who've been well funded, the broader spectrum of Indian startups, can we create a level playing field for them compared to the global behemoths? That's one. I think the second is also, can we make sure that SMEs, small and medium enterprises, can leverage the power of e-commerce, can actually grow and are not impacted, and their rights can be protected. And I would say a big part, at least the meetings that I've been a part of, a large focus is on the consumer. This is not just with respect to discounting. This is with respect to things like data protection. The data that is emerging from India, is that data going to be protected? What about privacy? And this is not limited to India. GDPR has recently come out in the EU. The United States has made, significant progress. Now, I think we've, in no uncertain terms, made our point very, very clear that any regulation should be as light touch as possible. Because if there is over-regulation, and if
this doesn't look like, does this look like light touch regulation, Abhiraj? Even though you were part of the consultation process, let me ask you, does this look like light touch regulation to you? An honest answer.
At this point of time, it definitely does not look like light touch. I think this is, for a first draft, very, very, this is very significant regulation, and that, it's something that does concern me, to be honest, because I think we've seen, sectors like IT and ITES, which for a very long time did not, have any regulation. Actually, today, one of the best governed sectors, highest levels of corporate governance. Yes. They've given us the first $100 billion company. In TCS and other sectors which have apparently a lot of regulation, whether it's banking or electricity or telcos, one can't argue exactly in that favor. So I think we're in the early stages of the e-commerce sector. I wouldn't say there should be no regulation, but I've always been in favor of minimal regulation.
There is regulation. I don't understand where the question of no regulation comes in. There is regulation. There are very clear press note directives that are in place. So I don't understand where the question of no regulation comes in. But let me go back across to Ajay Dua. Mr. Dua, I can understand some of the anxiety that homegrown startups are faced with. And I would also imagine that there is some legitimacy to the argument that, the Companies Act be amended to allow Indian promoters to have more control despite even small shareholding. I would imagine that perhaps ought to have been something that should have been done in the past. Maybe now it's a little too late, but this is perhaps a consideration that should be taken forward. But, you know, as Abhiraj himself is pointing out, and he was part of this consultative process, maybe the well-intentioned, but now over the top. What would you be most worried about from the you know, plethora of recommendations that this e-commerce policy puts forward?
As I once said, we got to look at the consumer, as put him at the center of things, and then form the policy. As of now, I think it's an early thoughts on the subject within the government, and that too by putting together what already existed in various other dispensations, rules, regulations, press notes, etc. of the government. I would like to see, going forward, first, e-commerce being more precisely defined. Where would this policy be applicable? And not, as was mentioned earlier, that does it cover e-financing, does it cover e-travel, all those kind of, number one. Number two, I would like to see in this policy no creation of another regulatory body. Regulations, as you said, is different from centralizing the administration into one particular body. The regulator can't be looking at the competition aspects. That will have to be looked at by the Competition Commission, unless by law you amend the law and take away their powers. Similarly, when we talk about FDI, here it's the draft policy says complaints about FDI will also be looked at by the regulator. What happens to the Reserve Bank of India? What happens to the Ministry of Finance and others? So I think let's not centralize everything in just to keep a body occupied. That's the number two. Number three, I would like to see in this much greater ability to implement what is being thought of, particularly in the context of 49% FDI, in what we are calling inventory-based model, and only if all the goods are locally sourced, which I think there are three distinct conditions being put there. Are we moving towards that in our whole scheme of retailing, or are we liberalizing there but bringing about greater limitations and constraints when it comes to e-commerce? Finally, I would like to see in this that recognize, as you very rightly in the beginning said, that capital is global. So I would say now production is also global. Competitive advantages of production, advantages or the benefits of it must flow to the consumer around the world. And if a particular item can be sourced from outside the country because there happens to be a comparative advantage in that, why should we say that the foreign capital cannot deal with it? When the foreign capital brings with it maybe cheaper capital, brings with it economies of scale, and also will be able to demonstrate all the advantages with modern telecommunication, computer-based, digital-based economies have.
Amarjit, let me ask you, as I pointed out, of the many recommendations made on the issue of ownership, perhaps that is a point worth considering and worth pondering over. The need to amend the relevant provisions in the Companies Act so as to facilitate founders to have control over their e-commerce companies despite having a small shareholding. This obviously in light of the experiences that we've already seen play out. Do you believe that that is a legitimate concern that requires some degree of intervention at this point?
So Shireen, if you just look at the Indian Companies Act, it talks about differential voting rights already. And there are rules under which they say that the company should actually be profitable for a period of 3 years. The DVRs cannot be in excess of 26%. So there are already regulations about differential voting rights which are existing under the Companies Act. But this is an instrument which talks about differential voting rights. As far as the control is concerned, which is the point which has been referred to in this particular policy, that is something which is typically going along with a contractual relationship. Now, when they are talking about that the control should remain with the Indian founder, it means we are talking about a third kind of instrument which has to come into play. which is besides a DVR or a version of a DVR itself. So that would require a change as far as the Companies Act is concerned, and I think which can be done. But the point is, just think about a fact. If we just look at what we have seen in case of some of the unicorns in India, yes, the founders have been diluted as far as the equity is concerned, but they still control a lot of operations. So there are in their agreements, they already have a lot of operational control in terms of as far as the entity is concerned, even when they are holding 8 to 10% of the equity. So that is already existing. I think by putting all these things, we are actually confusing the foreign investor now, because what is going to happen if an Indian founder goes and tells a foreign investor, you put in the money, but I will retain the control based on the fact because the government has told me so, it will become difficult even for the founder to raise money. So I would say that the current regime on its own is good enough, and you know, and the definition of control. And the definition of control under the FDI policy of FEMA 20 is they already talk about control over board of directors, control over management and operations, and those already exist with the Indian founders. I'm just saying there's a confusion which is being created by putting all these things.
Exactly. That was my point, that there is enough regulation already in place. So I don't understand where the issue of there is no regulation and hence we require some regulation, where that comes in from. But Abhiraj, let me ask you, because you have acknowledged the fact that you believe that this has become over the top. What you wanted was light touch and this is OTT. What is it that you have a problem with on the basis of what you've seen in this 19-page document?
I think, you know, I will not get into the specifics of the document, but, you know, my larger concern, you know, as an entrepreneur is with regulation per se. The fact that there will be a regulator and now there will be regulatory oversight that will be deciding the pace at which this industry should move. I'll take a small example. You know, one of the recommendations talks about the need to have data centers in India. This is actually going to impact startup companies because most of us will use AWS and you know, cloud-based solutions, whether it's for data, whether it's for cloud computing, and if you need to have, you know, data housed in India, it actually increases your cost. So it makes you less you know, less competitive. It makes the cost of starting up a little bit higher, and more importantly, you have to interface with some government department, some government regulator, which is never easy and something that an entrepreneur does not want to do. So I think my larger concern is this interface that will get created at various points of your business, which, as we know, you know, the interesting part here is the intent is always good. I think, you know, the government is coming from a place of great intent. They want to help Indian entrepreneurs, Indian companies, Indian consumers. But we understand the intention in the long run doesn't work, because over a period of time you will have you will have regular government officials who will man these positions and will fundamentally regulatory cholesterol will set in, which will stop the pace of innovation. So that's my larger concern.
Regulatory cholesterol. That's a nice term. But you know, I do want to point out that we really have to be careful what we wish for, and this is the message to India's startup ecosystem, because you know, people were lobbying with the government, seeking government intervention, and now look where you find yourselves. So you know, you really have to be careful what you wish for, but regulatory cholesterol should not block the arteries of India's e-commerce ecosystem. That's a good one to take a break on. We'll be back with a lot more. Stay with us.